The air in the VFW hall was thick with the smell of stale beer, fried onions, and decades of old stories. It was a comfortable smell to most of the men who gathered there on Tuesday nights, a scent that reminded them of camaraderie, of shared histories written in places far from their quiet town of Oak Haven, Ohio. But for Sergeant Anya Sharma, the smell was suffocating. She sat alone at a small table in the corner, a glass of cola sweating in her hand, the condensation tracing a wet ring on the dark wood. She wasn't a regular. In fact, it was her first time here. Her therapist, a kind man at the VA with a gentle voice and tired eyes, had suggested it. "Community, Anya," he'd said. "You need to connect with people who get it." Anya wasn't so sure. The men in this room were from a different era. Their wars were fought in jungles and on different continents, under different presidents with different rules of engagement. Their uniforms were a different color. Still, she had promised she would try. She had been in Oak Haven for 6 months, living in a small, rented house on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, yet no one seemed to know her at all. She kept to herself, her only companions the silence of her home and the memories that played on a loop in her mind. She was 28 years old, but some days she felt ancient. Her body was a roadmap of her service, a slight limp from a shattered ankle, a network of faint scars on her forearms, and a deep, persistent ache in her soul that no amount of physical therapy could fix. Tonight, the VFW was louder than usual. A group of older veterans, mostly from the Vietnam era, were gathered around the bar, their voices rising and falling in familiar rhythms of friendly argument and boisterous laughter. The ringleader seemed to be a man named Al, a big, barrel-chested man with a booming voice and a white flat-top haircut. He was holding court, a half-empty pitcher of beer in front of him. "I'm telling you, Henderson," Al bellowed, slapping his hand on the bar. "There's no way a .223 round can do that much damage at 600 yards. Not unless the wind is your best friend and God himself is guiding the bullet." Another man, wiry and with a weathered face, shook his head. "You're forgetting the fragmentation." "Al, those M16 rounds, they tumble. Nasty business." Anya listened quietly, the technical talk a familiar language. She had spent 10 years in the army, much of it in the dust and heat of Afghanistan. She knew ballistics better than she knew how to make small talk. She understood the physics of a bullet's flight, the subtle art of reading the wind, the precise calculation of drop and drift. It was a science, but for her it had also been an art form. She took a slow sip of her cola, the sweet fizz doing little to calm the unease in her stomach. She felt like an exhibit in a museum, a relic from a war these men only saw on the news. They glanced at her from time to time, their eyes lingering for a moment before moving on. She was an anomaly, a woman, young, and alone in their sanctuary. The conversation at the bar shifted, as it often did, to tales of service. Stories were the currency of this place, traded back and forth like well-worn coins. Each man tried to top the other with a tale of hardship, bravery, or sheer dumb luck. Anya stayed silent, her own stories locked away, too heavy and too sharp to share in a place like this. It was when Al started talking about snipers that her ears perked up. "The best shot I ever saw," Al declared, his voice dropping to a more serious tone, "was a guy in my unit, name of Deadeye Miller. Kid from Nebraska. He could hit a mosquito on a gnat's behind from a click-out. Used an M40, a thing of beauty. That's real shooting. Not this new stuff with all the computers and gadgets." He took a long pull from his beer, wiping the foam from his lips with the back of his hand. His eyes swept the room and, for the first time, they landed on Anya and stayed there. There was a challenge in his gaze, a dismissive curl to his lip. "What about you, sweetheart?" he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the suddenly quiet room. "You were in, right? Army, I see from that pin on your jacket. You ever see any action, or did they have you filing papers back at Bagram?" A few of his buddies snickered, Anya felt a familiar heat rise in her cheeks. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was a weary frustration, the kind she had felt 1,000 times before. She had been one of the first women to graduate from the U.S. Army Sniper School, a grueling course that had tested the very limits of her physical and mental endurance. She had served 2 tours as a sniper team leader, operating in some of the most hostile territory on the planet. She had saved lives. She had taken them. And now, in a VFW hall in Ohio, she was being asked if she filed papers. She gave a small, tight smile. "I saw some things," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Al wasn't satisfied. He pushed himself off his bar stool and ambled over to her table, his friends watching with amusement. He loomed over her, his shadow falling across the table. "Some things, huh?" he said, leaning down, his voice a low rumble. "We're all friends here, all brothers in arms. You can tell us. What was your MOS? Your job?" Anya met his gaze directly. She didn't flinch. She had faced down men with far worse intentions than Al. "I was an infantryman," she stated simply. 11 Bravo. A murmur went through the small group of men who had followed Al over. 11 Bravo was the designation for an infantryman, the backbone of the army, the frontline fighters. It was a world they understood, but for a woman of her age it was still a relatively new and, for some, unwelcome development. Al grunted, a flicker of something, maybe respect, maybe surprise, in his eyes. "All right, 11 Bravo, fair enough. But what did you do? Carry a rifle? Drive a truck?" Anya took a deliberate breath, letting it out slowly. She knew where this was going. She could lie, deflect, change the subject. It would be easier. It would let her fade back into the corner, anonymous and invisible. But something inside her, a stubborn spark of pride that had survived everything else, refused to let her. She had earned her place. She had earned her story. "I was a sniper," she said. The silence that followed was heavier than the thick, stale air. It was a silence filled with disbelief. The snickers that had been suppressed now broke free. One of the men behind Al let out a short, derisive laugh. Al himself just stared at her, his eyes narrowing. He looked her up and down, taking in her slender frame, her quiet demeanor. What he saw clearly didn't match the image of a sniper he held in his mind. The image of Deadeye Miller from Nebraska, the image of rugged, weathered men who could kill from a mile away. "A sniper?" Al repeated, drawing the words out as if tasting them. He chuckled, a deep, patronizing sound. "Honey, with all due respect, you don't look like a sniper. The girls they had over there when I was in were nurses, clerks, good women doing their part, but not that." "Things have changed, Al," said the wiry man, whose name was Gene. He had a thoughtful look on his face, but there was still doubt in his eyes. "Some things don't change," Al shot back, his gaze still locked on Anya. "You can't just slap a patch on someone and call him a sniper. It takes a certain kind of person, a certain kind of man." The injustice of it all washed over Anya, cold and bitter. The years of training, the days spent lying motionless in the dirt, the blistering sun, the freezing nights, the weight of the rifle, the heavier weight of the responsibility. The faces of the men she had protected, the ghosts of the enemies she had faced, all of it, everything she was, everything she had done, was being dismissed with a wave of a hand, by a man who knew nothing about her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were quiet, but they cut through the noise. "I graduated top of my class at Fort Benning," she said, her voice steady. "My longest confirmed kill was at 2,534 meters. I served with the 75th Ranger Regiment, my spotter, and I completed over 100 successful missions." She laid the facts out like stones, simple, hard, and undeniable, but to the men in the room, they sounded like fantasy. 2,534 meters. That was over 1.5 miles. It was a legendary distance, the kind of shot that became a myth, whispered about in barracks and training grounds. It was not the kind of shot a quiet young woman in a corner VFW hall claimed as her own. Al threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, ugly sound that filled the room. 1.5 miles, he roared, slapping his knee. Boys, did you hear that? We got a regular Audie Murphy in here. Honey, that's a good one. You almost had me. The other men joined in, their laughter, a chorus of ridicule. They saw her not as a soldier, but as a liar, a young woman seeking attention, trying to steal the valor that they believed belonged only to them. Anya felt the walls of the room closing in. The therapist's words about community echoed in her mind, a hollow, mocking sound. She had come here seeking connection, a place to belong. Instead, she had found the same tired, dismissive attitudes she had fought against her entire career. She stood up, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. The laughter died down as she reached into her wallet and pulled out a few dollars, placing them on the table to cover her drink. Her face was a mask of calm, betraying none of the turmoil inside. She looked at Al, at the smug, triumphant look on his face. "You have a good night, gentlemen," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. She turned and walked towards the door, the weight of their stares on her back. She could feel their smirks, hear their whispered jokes. As her hand touched the cool metal of the doorknob, Al's voice boomed. The cool night air was a welcome shock to Anya's system, clearing some of the hot frustration that had fogged her mind. The streetlights of Oak Haven cast long, lonely shadows on the sidewalk. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing deeply, letting the quiet of the small town settle over her. She had half a mind to get in her truck and never look back. Drive until Oak Haven and the faces in that VFW hall were just a bad memory. But running wasn't in her nature. She had held her ground in far more dangerous places. She had just reached her pickup truck, an old but reliable Ford, when she heard the VFW door creak open again. She tensed, her hand instinctively going to her side, a phantom gesture for a weapon that was no longer there. "Ma'am?" "Hold on a second." Anya turned. It was Gene, the wiry man with the weathered face. He was holding his old, faded baseball cap in his hands, twisting the brim nervously. He walked towards her slowly, his expression uncertain. I wanted to apologize for Al," he said, stopping a few feet away. "He gets a few beers in him, and his mouth gets ahead of his brain. He doesn't mean no harm." Anya looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It's fine," she said, her voice flat. She just wanted to go home. "No, it's not fine," Gene insisted, taking a step closer. "What he said in there, that was wrong. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. You served. That deserves respect. Period." Anya studied his face. She saw genuine regret in his eyes, not pity, but the quiet shame of a man who had stood by while an injustice was done. It was a look she recognized. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words held a sliver of warmth. Gene nodded, looking down at his cap. "The thing is, that shot you mentioned, 2,534 meters. That's a hell of a claim, ma'am. The current record, the one everyone knows, is a Canadian sniper, a little over 3,500 meters. But before that, the American record was held by a ranger, a guy named Brian Creamer, 2,300 meters. What you're claiming, you'd be right up there with the legends." Anya didn't say anything. She just watched him, waiting. "Al and the boys, they're old school," Gene continued, as if trying to explain a foreign culture. "In our day, the equipment wasn't the same. A shot like that was impossible. So when they hear something that sounds impossible, they shut down. They can't wrap their heads around it." He finally looked up, meeting her eyes. "But me, I saw the way you said it. You weren't bragging. You were just stating a fact." A quiet moment passed between them. The distant sound of a train whistle echoed through the night. It was in the Shah-I-Kot Valley, Anya said, her voice barely above a whisper. We were providing overwatch for a special forces team pinned down by enemy mortar fire. The mortar was behind a ridge. We couldn't get a clean shot. My spotter, Sergeant Davis, he found a position. It was a crazy setup, uphill with a crosswind that was changing every few seconds. But we didn't have a choice. The team on the ground was about to be overrun. She paused, the memory as clear as if it were yesterday. The biting wind, the taste of dust in her mouth, the frantic voice of the SF captain in her ear. It wasn't a perfect shot, she continued. It took two. The first one was a ranging shot to see the splash and correct for the wind. The second one. It found its mark. It silenced the mortar. The team got out. Her voice was devoid of pride. It was the flat, factual tone of a report. The shot was confirmed by the SF team's laser rangefinder. It's in the after-action report. It's in my service record. Gene listened, his expression intent. He believed her. Anya could see it in the way he stood, in the way he met her gaze. He believed her, and that small act of faith felt like a lifeline. My God, he whispered, shaking his head in awe. A shot like that. To save those men. Before he could say more, the VFW door swung open again, spilling light and noise onto the sidewalk. Al stood silhouetted in the doorway, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. Well, well, look what we have here, he boomed. Gene, you trying to get the little lady's sob story? I told you she's full of it. Probably read it in a book somewhere. Gene turned, his face hardening. Shut up, Al. You've said enough tonight. Oh, I'm just getting started, Al said, stepping outside. A few of his friends followed, drawn by the prospect of more drama. I can't stand it. People coming in here telling lies, trying to make themselves out to be some kind of hero. This place is for real soldiers, not for storytellers. He pointed a thick finger at Anya. You want to claim you're a sniper? You want to claim you made a shot that most men can only dream of? Then prove it. Anya stared at him, her jaw tightening. I don't have to prove anything to you. That's what a liar would say, Al sneered. See? Backs down as soon as she's called. On it. That's enough, Al. Gene stepped between them, facing his old friend. Leave her be. But Al was on a roll, puffed up with self-righteousness and beer. No, I'm tired of it. My nephew just got back from his third tour. Saw things that would turn your hair white. He doesn't go around bragging about impossible shots. He just does his duty. This is an insult to him. It's an insult to all of us. An idea, ugly and mean, began to form on Al's face. A slow, malicious grin spread across his lips. I'll tell you what, he said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone. The gun club I belong to, out on Route 7. We have a 1,000-yard range, longest one in the county. This Saturday we're having our annual member shoot. A little friendly competition. He looked directly at Anya, his eyes gleaming. You show up. You bring this magic rifle of yours. You set up at the 1,000-yard line, and you hit the bullseye. Not just the target, the bullseye, 10 inches wide. You do that in front of everyone, and I will personally get down on my hands and knees and apologize. I'll buy you a drink every night for a year. I'll tell everyone in this town that Al Miller was a fool and you're the real deal. The challenge hung in the air, heavy and sharp. It was a public gauntlet, thrown down in front of his friends. It was designed to humiliate her, to force her to back down and admit she was lying. Gene turned to Anya, his expression pleading. You don't have to do this, ma'am. He's just trying to get a rise out of you. Anya looked past Gene, her eyes locking with Al's. She saw the absolute certainty in his face, the conviction that she was a fraud. She saw the smirks on the faces of his friends. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. It wasn't about pride anymore. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about honoring the truth. It was for Sergeant Davis, her spotter, who had died 2 weeks after that shot in a helicopter crash. It was for the men on the ground whose lives she had saved. It was for every woman who had ever been told she wasn't strong enough, good enough, or tough enough to stand in the line. Her decision was made in the space of a heartbeat. 1,000 yards is a warm-up, Anya said, her voice as cold and hard as steel. What's the prize for winning this competition? Al was taken aback. He hadn't expected her to accept, let alone with such confidence. He stammered for a moment. The prize? The prize is a plaque and bragging rights. That's not good enough, Anya said. She walked past Jean, closing the distance between herself and Al, until she was standing directly in front of him. He was a foot taller and outweighed her by 100 pounds, but she didn't seem to notice. You're so sure I'm a liar. You're so willing to stake your reputation on it, so let's make this interesting. She looked him dead in the eye. When I hit that bullseye, you will take out a full-page ad in the Oakhaven Gazette. In it, you will print a public apology to me by name, and you will make a $5,000 donation in my name to the Wounded Warrior Project. A gasp went through the small crowd. $5,000 was a lot of money in a town like Oakhaven. Al's face turned red. He was trapped. If he backed down now, he would look like a coward. If he accepted, he stood to lose a significant amount of money and face public humiliation. His pride, however, was a powerful force. You're on, he snarled, his voice a low growl. But when you miss, and you will miss, you're the one who takes out the ad. You'll admit to everyone in this town that you're a liar. And you'll never show your face in that VFW hall again. Fine, Anya said without hesitation. One more thing. I'm not shooting at a 10-inch bullseye from 1,000 yards. Al scoffed. Oh, what's the matter? Too small for you? It's too easy, Anya replied, her voice dropping, drawing them all in. I'll bring my own target. She turned and walked to her truck without another word, leaving Al and his friends standing on the sidewalk stunned into silence. Jean watched her go, a slow smile spreading across his face. He had a feeling that Al Miller had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Anya got into her truck and started the engine. As she pulled away from the curb, she glanced in the rear-view mirror. The men were still standing there, watching her go, their faces a mixture of anger, confusion, and for the first time a tiny flicker of doubt. The battle lines had been drawn. Saturday was coming. The next few days in Oakhaven were filled with a low, buzzing anticipation. News of the challenge spread like wildfire through the small town. It started at the VFW, of course, with Al Miller telling anyone who would listen about the arrogant young woman who claimed to be a sniper. From there, it traveled through the coffee shops, the barber shop, the local diner. Everyone had an opinion. Most sided with Al. He was a known quantity, a local fixture. The woman was an outsider, a mystery. Her story was just too fantastic to be believed. Anya was oblivious to most of it. She didn't read the local paper or listen to town gossip. She had work to do. The challenge, as foolish as it was, had given her something she hadn't realized she was missing. A mission. For the first time in months, she had a clear objective, a target, a purpose. Her small house had a 2-car garage, and it was there that she spent most of her time. The garage was her sanctuary, neat and organized in a way that the rest of her life was not. On a large workbench against the back wall, beneath a single bright fluorescent light, lay her tools. Not wrenches and screwdrivers, but the specialized instruments of her trade. Cleaning rods, bore guides, brushes, solvents, and patches. And in the center of it all, resting in a padded vise, was the heart of the matter. It was a Barrett M82A1, but it was also much more than that. To the uninitiated, it was a massive, intimidating piece of machinery. Nearly 5 feet long and weighing over 30 pounds, it looked more like a small cannon than a rifle. Its matte black finish seemed to drink the light. But to Anya, It was an old and trusted friend. She knew every pin, every spring, every inch of its cold, hard steel. She called it Goliath. This wasn't an Army-issue rifle. After her medical discharge, she had used a significant portion of her savings to purchase a civilian model. It was identical in almost every way to the one she had carried in the service. Owning it felt like holding on to a piece of herself, the part that was still strong, capable, and sure. She spent hours meticulously preparing Goliath for Saturday. This was her ritual, a process that was as much mental as it was physical. She disassembled the bolt carrier group, cleaning each component until it shone, removing every microscopic speck of carbon and grit. She ran a patch soaked in bore cleaner through the long, heavy barrel again and again until it came out perfectly white. The barrel was the soul of a rifle, and its cleanliness was paramount. As she worked, her mind was quiet. The familiar, repetitive motions soothed the restless energy that so often plagued her. Her hands, scarred and steady, moved with an economy and grace that came from thousands of hours of practice. While cleaning the muzzle brake, a heavy, arrow-shaped device designed to tame the rifle's ferocious recoil, her thoughts drifted back to Sergeant Marcus Davis. Davis had been her spotter. He was a lanky kid from Georgia with a goofy grin and an encyclopedic knowledge of baseball statistics. But behind a spotting scope, he was a genius. He could read mirage like it was a newspaper, calculate windage in his head faster than any computer, and his calm, steady voice in her ear had been her anchor in the chaos of combat. "All right, Anya," he would say, his voice a low drawl through the comms. "Wind's coming from your 9 o'clock, pushing 5, maybe 6 miles per hour. Little bit of a downdraft in that gully. Give me 2 clicks left and hold on the top edge. Of the target. Easy squeeze. Breathe." He had been with her for the 2,534-meter shot. He was the one who had found the target, done the math, and talked her onto it. "This is a unicorn, Sharma," he'd whispered in awe after the confirmation came through. "They're going to be talking about this one at Benning for the next 50 years. 2 weeks later, he was gone. A routine transport chopper went down in the mountains. There were no survivors. Anya had been left with the memory of the shot, a unicorn that now felt more like a ghost. Al's challenge, in a strange way, felt like an opportunity to honor Davis's memory, to prove that what they had accomplished together was real. On Friday afternoon, she focused on the ammunition. The 50 BMG cartridge was a monster, as long as a man's hand. But for a shot at 1,000 yards that demanded absolute precision, factory-loaded ammunition wasn't good enough. Anya loaded her own. She sat at a smaller bench set up with a reloading press. One by one, she measured out precise amounts of powder onto a digital scale, accurate to a single kernel. She seated the massive 750-grain bullets into the polished brass casings, ensuring each one was set to the exact same depth. Consistency was everything. Each round had to be a perfect twin to the last. She was creating a string of identical bullets, each one a promise of precision. She loaded 20 of them, far more than she would need. A sniper always has a backup plan. Finally, she turned her attention to the target. She had dismissed Al's 10-inch bullseye as too easy, and she meant it. At 1,000 yards, a 10-inch circle was a reasonable challenge for a skilled marksman with a standard rifle. For a Barrett 50 and a world-class sniper, it was a chip shot. She needed to make a statement. She took a piece of 1/4-inch steel plate from a corner of the garage. It was a 2-foot square. Using a can of white spray paint, she coated the entire surface. Once it was dry, she took a can of bright red paint. In the very center of the white square, she placed a silver dollar. It was a 1922 peace dollar that her grandfather, a World War II vet, had given her for good luck before her first deployment. She carefully sprayed a perfect red circle around the coin. When she removed the coin, a circle of bare metal, exactly 1.5 inches in diameter, remained in the center of the red dot. That was her target. Not the red dot, not the white plate, the silver dollar-sized circle of naked steel in the absolute center. It was an audacious, almost impossible target at that distance. It was a declaration of confidence that bordered on arrogance. And that was exactly the point. On Saturday morning, the sky was a brilliant cloudless blue. The air was cool and still. A perfect day for shooting. Anya drove her truck out to the Oak Haven Rod and Gun Club on Route 7. As she pulled up the long gravel driveway, she could see that the place was packed. Cars and trucks lined the parking lot and spilled out onto the grass. It seemed like half the town had turned out to watch the showdown. She saw Al standing near the main clubhouse, surrounded by his cronies from the VFW. He looked confident, laughing and joking, playing the part of the magnanimous host. But when his eyes met Anya's as she got out of her truck, his smile faltered for a second. Anya ignored him. She went to the back of her truck and lowered the tailgate. She pulled out a long, heavy-duty Pelican case, the kind used to transport sensitive equipment. Then came a folded-up bipod, a sandbag for a rear rest, and a spotting scope on a tripod. Gene met her as she was gathering her gear. He looked nervous, his eyes wide as he took in the crowd. "I didn't think this many people would show up," he said, his voice low. "Al's been running his mouth all over town. He's made this into a real spectacle." "Let him," Anya said calmly, her focus entirely on her equipment. "He's just making the stage bigger." She carried her gear to the designated firing line. The range was set in a wide valley with a massive earthen berm at the far end to stop the bullets. The 1,000-yard markers were barely visible in the distance. A range officer, a man in a bright orange vest, came over. "You're the challenger?" he asked, looking at her with a skeptical eye. "Al said you'd be here. You know the rules? One shot. Closest to the center wins the competition. But your bet with Al is for the bullseye." "I know the rules," Anya said, "and I brought my own target." She handed him the steel plate. The range officer looked at the tiny silver circle in the middle and then back at her, his eyebrows raised, in disbelief. He let out a low whistle. "Lady, you've got guts. I'll give you that," he said, shaking his head. He took the target and walked off to have it placed at the 1,000-yard mark. Anya began to set up her station. She moved with an unhurried, deliberate rhythm that drew the attention of the crowd. They watched as she opened the Pelican case. The murmuring quieted as she lifted Goliath from its foam padding. The rifle was even bigger and more menacing up close. She attached the bipod to the front, the legs clicking securely into place. She settled onto the shooting mat, placing the rifle's bipod legs firmly on the ground. Then she brought out the scope. It was a Night Force SHV, a powerful and incredibly precise piece of glass. She mounted it onto the rifle's top rail, her movements fluid and practiced. She spent several minutes adjusting it, making sure it was perfectly level. The crowd watched in a mixture of fascination and doubt. This was not the behavior of a liar. This was the calm, focused precision of an expert. Al, watching from a distance, felt the first real pang of uncertainty. The woman knew what she was doing. Anya lay down behind the rifle, settling her body into the earth. She looked through the scope, adjusting the focus until the distant target snapped into sharp relief. Even with the powerful magnification, the 1.5-inch circle was just a tiny speck. She took one of the hand-loaded cartridges and slid it into the chamber, the action smooth and heavy. She closed the bolt. The sound, a solid, definitive clack. She was ready. She looked over at the range officer who was watching her through binoculars. She gave him a simple, sharp nod. The officer raised a megaphone to his lips. "The line is hot," he announced, his voice booming across the valley. "Shoot her." The world, for Anya, had shrunk to the diameter of her scope. The chattering crowd, the weight of their expectations, the smug face of Al Miller. It all faded away into a distant, irrelevant hum. There was only the circle of light, the fine lines of the reticle and the target. Through the powerful optic, The 1,000-yard range seemed compressed. She could see the texture of the white paint on the steel plate, the sharp edge of the red circle, and in the center, the tiny 1.5-inch disc of bare metal shimmered in the morning light. It was an absurdly small target, a testament to either supreme confidence or utter foolishness. She settled the stock of the Barrett into the pocket of her shoulder. The rifle was a part of her, an extension of her will. Her left hand rested gently under the buttstock, ready to make minute adjustments. Her right hand curled around the pistol grip, her index finger resting lightly on the side of the trigger guard. This was her sanctuary. The place where the noise in her head went silent. The place where there was only one truth. The flight of the bullet. She checked the wind. It was almost non-existent, a gentle zephyr drifting from left to right. A gift. On a day with a gusting crosswind, this shot would be nearly impossible. Today, it was merely improbable. She had already calculated the ballistics in her head, a familiar equation. At this distance, with this ammunition, the massive .50 caliber bullet would drop more than 30 feet. She had already adjusted the scope's elevation turret to compensate, the precise clicks of the knob a familiar sound. She would need to hold just a fraction to the left to account for the slight breeze and the spin drift of the bullet. She looked through the scope again, placing the center of the crosshairs on her target. Breathe in. The reticle rose slightly. Breathe out. The reticle settled back down. She found her natural respiratory pause, the still point between breaths. The crowd held its collective breath. They had come expecting a spectacle, a fraud to be exposed. But watching her, they felt a shift. Her focus was absolute, her movements economical and sure. This was not a performance. This was a process. Al Miller watched, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The knot of unease in his stomach had grown into a leaden weight. He had seen men on the firing line his whole life. He knew the look of a true marksman. He was seeing it now, and it was making him sick. He had wanted to humiliate her, to put her in her place. Now he felt a growing dread that he was the one who was about to be humiliated. Gene stood a little ways off, his old baseball cap clutched in his hands. He found himself praying, not for Anya to win a bet, but for her to find a moment of peace, a moment of validation that she so clearly deserved. Back on the line, Anya's finger moved from the trigger guard to the trigger itself. She rested the pad of her finger on the cool, curved steel. She applied the slightest pressure, just enough to take up the slack. Her mind went back to the Shai-Kot Valley, to Davis, his voice calm and steady in her ear. "Easy squeeze, Sharma. Surprise yourself." It was what he always said. Don't jerk the trigger. Don't anticipate the shot. Apply slow, steady pressure until the rifle fires, as if of its own accord. A surprise break. She took one last, slow breath. She let it out. The world was perfectly still. The crosshairs were perfectly aligned. She began to apply pressure. The trigger broke. The explosion was immense, a deafening, concussive blast that rolled across the valley and slammed into the chests of the onlookers. It was a sound of pure power, a physical force that made the air itself vibrate. The Barrett bucked against her shoulder, a violent but controlled recoil, and a huge cloud of dust and debris erupted from the ground around the muzzle brake. For Anya, the moment of the shot was a strange, timeless bubble. She felt the recoil, saw the muzzle flash, but her focus remained downrange, through the scope. The recoil was so immense that she lost sight of the target for a fraction of a second as the rifle jumped, but she was already back on it. Her practiced, recovery instantaneous. Through the scope, she saw it. A tiny dark hole had appeared as if by magic in the exact center of the silver circle. A beat of silence passed. The crowd was stunned, first by the sheer violence of the shot and then by the anticipation of the result. They couldn't see the target from that distance. They looked to the range officer, who was staring intently through a powerful spotting scope. The range officer lowered his scope, his mouth slightly agape. He looked over at Anya, who was already calmly pulling back the bolt to eject the spent casing. The huge brass shell spun through the air and landed on the mat with a soft clink. He then looked at the crowd. He seemed to be at a loss for words. He simply raised his hand and gave a thumbs up. Then he picked up his megaphone, his voice cracking slightly with disbelief. "Hit," he announced. It's a direct hit. Bullseye." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a wave of collective disbelief. Al Miller's face went pale. "He said bullseye," one of his friends whispered. "That's the 10-inch circle." "No," Al said, his voice a choked whisper. Her bet was for my bullseye." Before anyone could process what that meant, the range officer spoke again, his voice now filled with awe. "Ladies and gentlemen, the shot is not in the bullseye. It is in the center of the bullseye. It appears to be a direct hit on the challenger's custom target." He paused, as if he couldn't believe what he was about to say. "We have a remote camera on the target. We're putting it on the monitor in the clubhouse." There was a sudden surge, as people rushed towards the small clubhouse, eager to see the proof. Anya remained on the mat, unmoving. She knew where the bullet had gone. She didn't need to see it on a screen. Gene was the first to reach her. He had tears in his eyes. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew you were telling the truth. I knew it." Anya finally pushed herself up, a faint smile touching her lips. "It was a good day for it," she said softly. "The wind was quiet." Inside the clubhouse, a crowd was gathered around a large television screen. The image was grainy, broadcast from a small camera near the target berm. But it was clear enough. There, in the center of the screen, was Anya's steel plate. And there, in the dead center of the red circle, in the dead center of the 1.5-inch silver dollar, was a perfect, round hole. The bullet had passed clean through. A stunned silence fell over the room. They had come to see a liar exposed. Instead, they had witnessed an act of almost supernatural skill. It was a shot that none of them, in all their years of shooting, would have believed possible. Then, an old man in the back of the room, a veteran of the Korean War who rarely spoke, said in a quiet, reverent voice, "My God, that's the greatest shot I've ever seen." The spell was broken. The room erupted in a cacophony of excited chatter, applause, and shouts of disbelief. Al Miller stood alone outside, unable to bring himself to go in. He had heard the announcement. He had heard the reaction. He felt sick. It wasn't about the money or the public apology. It was the shattering of his entire worldview. He had been so certain, so smugly, arrogantly certain that she was lying. His certainty had been built on a foundation of prejudice about her age, her gender, her quiet demeanor, and she had just demolished that foundation with a single, perfectly placed bullet. He saw Anya walking from the firing line, her big rifle case in one hand, her gear in the other. She walked with her head held high, not with arrogance, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had proven her point. The crowd began to part for her as she approached, people clapping her on the back, shaking her hand, their faces filled with awe and respect. She walked right up to Al. The crowd went silent again, eager to see the final act of the drama. Al couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the ground, his face flushed with shame. He started, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to say." "You know what you have to do," Anya said, her voice not unkind. "A deal is a deal." Al finally looked up, his eyes filled with a grudging respect. "The ad will be in the paper on Monday," he said. "And the donation?" "I'll make the donation this afternoon." He paused, then added, That was one hell of a shot, Sergeant." "Thank you," Anya said. She turned to leave, her point made, her truth vindicated. But just as she turned, a car came speeding up the gravel driveway, a military police vehicle from the nearby army base. Two uniformed MPs got out, along with a stern-looking man in a decorated uniform, a full colonel. He scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on Anya. "Sergeant Anya Sharma," the colonel called out, his voice authoritative. Anya froze. A flicker of old anxiety went through her. "Yes, sir," she answered, instinctively straightening her posture. "I'm Colonel Matthews, the base commander," he said, walking towards her. "We've been trying to reach you, Sergeant. I'm glad we found you," the crowd murmured, confused. What was happening? The colonel stopped in front of her, his expression serious. "Sergeant, a few days ago, some new information came to light regarding the American sniper record. There was an error in the original report for the previous record holder. After a review, his shot was officially downgraded due to new atmospheric data." He took a deep breath, his eyes locking on hers. "As of 0900 this morning, the Department of Defense has officially reviewed and certified a new record for the longest confirmed sniper kill in the history of the United States Army." The colonel's face broke into a proud smile. "Congratulations, Sergeant Sharma," he announced, his voe. The colonel's words hung in the air, more powerful than the report of the Barrett. A wave of stunned comprehension washed over the crowd. It was one thing to see an impossible shot made right before their eyes. It was another thing entirely to learn that it was simply confirmation of a legendary record-breaking truth. The silence stretched for a long moment, thick with awe and the collective shame of their doubt. Then, someone started to clap. It was Gene, his face streaked with tears, his applause loud and heartfelt in the quiet. The single clap was joined by another and then another, until the entire gun club erupted in a thunderous ovation. It wasn't just applause for the shot they had witnessed. It was an apology, a salute, an offering of the respect they had so wrongly withheld. Anya stood frozen, the colonel's words echoing in her ears. The record. It had never been about a record for her. It was about saving the men on the ground. It was about doing her job. The fact that it was now an official historical fact felt surreal, like a dream she couldn't quite grasp. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the same faces that had looked at her with scorn and disbelief just hours before. Now they looked at her with a reverence usually reserved for heroes in history books. Colonel Matthews stepped forward and offered his hand. "We tried to call you, Sergeant. The announcement is going to be in the national news tomorrow. We wanted you to hear it from us first. The Army is incredibly proud of what you accomplished." Anya shook his hand, her own feeling small in his firm grip. "Thank you, sir," she managed to say, her voice quiet. "I was just doing my duty." "You did more than that," the colonel said, his voice softening. "You saved the lives of 6 Special Forces operators that day. Their report made it very clear. They wouldn't have made it out without you and your spotter, Sergeant Davis." He paused, his expression becoming somber. "His family will be notified of this honor as well. His contribution will be part of the official record." Hearing Davis's name brought a lump to Anya's throat. This was for him, too. This was for his memory. A wave of emotion, one she had suppressed for years, washed over her. It wasn't sadness, but a profound sense of peace, of a circle finally being closed. Al Miller pushed his way through the crowd. He stopped in front of Anya, his face pale and his eyes red-rimmed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep and humbling shame. He looked not at Anya, but at the colonel. "Sir." Al said, his voice thick. I'm Al Miller. I'm the one who caused all this. He took a shaky breath. I want to apologize. To you, sir, for disrespecting one of your soldiers. And to you, Sergeant. He finally turned to Anya, and for the first time, he looked her in the eye as an equal. Sergeant Sharma, I was wrong. What I said, what I did, there's no excuse. I was arrogant, and I was a fool. I hope you can forgive me. Anya looked at the man who had been her tormentor. She saw not a villain, but a man confronted with a truth. So powerful it had shattered his prejudices. He had been wrong, but he was owning it, publicly and completely. I forgive you, Al, she said, and she meant it. The anger she had felt was gone, washed away by the events of the day. Holding on to it would only weigh her down. Al nodded, his shoulders slumping in relief. The ad in the paper is still happening, he said firmly. And the donation. I'm doubling it. It's the least I can do. The crowd began to disperse, talking in hushed, excited tones about what they had witnessed. The story of this day would become an Oak Haven legend, told and retold for years to come. The day the quiet woman from out of town silenced the doubters with a single shot and a truth that shook the whole town. Jean came and stood by Anya's side. What are you going to do now, Sergeant? He asked gently. Anya looked out over the valley at the distant target with the perfect hole in its center. She felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt since she'd taken off the uniform. The ghosts of her past, the memories that had haunted her in the silence of her house, seemed to have quieted. They hadn't disappeared, but their weight was less. I think, she said, a real smile finally reaching her eyes. I'm going to go home. And for the first time in a long time, I think I'm going to get a good night's sleep. The following Tuesday, Anya walked back into the VFW hall. As she stepped through the door, the room went silent. Every eye turned to her. But this time, the stares were not filled with suspicion. They were filled with awe. Al was behind the bar. He saw her, and a wide, genuine smile spread across his face. He pulled a tall, clean glass from the rack. What can I get for you, Sergeant? He asked, his voice full of respect. It's on the house, for the next year. Anya walked to the bar and took a seat. The men made room for her, nodding their heads in greeting. Jean was there, and he patted the stool next to him. Just a cola. Al, she said. As Al placed the drink in front of her, he slid a copy of the Oak Haven Gazette across the bar. There, on page 3, was a full-page ad. At the top, in big, bold letters, it said, "A public apology to a true American hero." Below it was Al's apology, heartfelt and sincere, and a picture of Anya that the colonel's office must have provided, a formal photo of her in her dress uniform, her chest adorned with medals. At the bottom, it mentioned her record-breaking shot and the $10,000 donation made in her name. Anya looked at the ad, then at the faces of the men around her. They were looking at her not as an outsider, not as a woman trying to be a man, but as one of them, a soldier, a sister in arms. She had come to this place seeking community, a place to belong. She had been met with mockery and disbelief. But she hadn't run. She had stood her ground, faced the challenge, and let the truth speak for itself. It had spoken with the force of a .50 caliber bullet, and it had been heard. She took a long, slow sip of her cola. The air in the VFW hall still smelled of stale beer and fried onions. But to Anya, for the first time, it smelled like home. War was over, the fight was done, and Sergeant Anya Sharma was finally, truly welcome.